morning, good afternoon, good evening, public safety community, and others watching PSN Now, News of the Week. I am Jason Karp, Esquire, here with my good friend and colleague, Tegan Jedediah Kennedy, otherwise known as TJ. What's up, TJ?
Hey, Jason, I see you found that old shirt in the back of your closet this morning.
You know, I've had this since high school. I said, let's break it out. We're in a pandemic. Why not? Let's get crazy with it. Let's turn it up a notch.
Aloha.
Absolutely. Aloha all. So welcome to this week's episode. Again, a lot of news, a lot of things going on, both with COVID, with policing reforms, and of course, technology. Let's jump into a little bit of what's going on with COVID. So recent reports, as we're reopening the country, there's been concern that there's going to be the second wave, especially in the fall and as we get into the flu season. And there's been talking about already maybe even a second wave with some of the reopening. But what experts are saying, especially in the U.S., is we're still in the first wave here. And I think we're seeing some of that now, particularly in the southern states, right? So Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, Texas, California, seeing record numbers again. And I know in other parts of the country, people are getting out and there's maybe a false sense of security. But the numbers are really telling the story that we are still quite, in the middle of this pandemic and need to continue to take measures to protect ourselves. Another piece of anecdotal evidence on that regard is as the EU is now considering reopening its borders July 1st or the beginning of July, they've made a list of countries that are able to travel into the EU and those that aren't. And unfortunately, the United States, really kind of first time in history I could think of where we'd be singled out like this, are going to be on the do not travel list or because of the increasing numbers of cases of COVID and the way that the pandemic's been handled just generally. So we're still right in the middle of this thing, even though some folks are maybe feeling a little bit better about it. I know in Virginia cases are down, but we've just started reopening. So we'll have to see what happens. But really important that everybody remain vigilant and continue to exercise CDC recommended protocols and masks and social distancing so we can get through this.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're still in the first wave. There's still increases in half the states in the country, and so there's lots of work to be done. Certainly, we've been able to keep hospitals so far from being overloaded in most cases. But I think I heard last night down in Arizona, they were hitting about 84% of ICU bed capacity, and that's certainly starting to get pretty nervous. So I think that, for our healthcare workers, for our emergency medical service providers, firefighters, others that are responding to this every day, also continuing to hear people not leveraging calling 911 and emergency medical services like they should, and that we're having a continued reduction in cardiac arrest survival rates, and that we're having more and more people arrive at the emergency room either by POV, by their own vehicle, or too late to be saved. So we really need to encourage everybody in the world, for that matter, to call your emergency services when you're having things like a heart attack or signs of a stroke or other things that you normally would. Those services are there for you. They definitely have focused on decontamination of emergency vehicles to make sure that there's no danger to patients that are being transported. And we've spent a lot of time over the years getting folks to leverage our critical emergency medical services early, which has really changed the survival rates. And we've seen that really fall apart in the last couple of months. So just want to remind folks of that.
Yeah, no, excellent point. And I know all our first responders and public safety are encouraging that. And of course, we noted last week, Loudon and issued a press release, and if folks who are non-public safety, if they happen to see this, call your ER, call your hospital facilities, and you can ask them what they're doing. But I think they're all putting in place some pretty responsible protocols to ensure that there's a very low risk of cross-contamination. So absolutely. So moving on to, the other continuing big topic that's going on around the country in terms of policing reform, what's happening there. A recent statement by former IACP President Terrence Cunningham, and I thought it was very interesting. I want to get your thoughts on it, where he said, he focused on, some of these reforms, but really focused on recruitment, which I thought was interesting, and that we need to recruit differently because we've been recruiting from a policing perspective that the majority of cases that agencies deal with are traditional policing, with a much smaller percentage being social services related. And he says we've kind of got to flip that on its head, that we're seeing a much bigger percentage of social services related cases that are defaulting to the police who may not necessarily have the skills or be trained to really manage that. and fewer actually on the policing. And we need to change that recruiting methodology. So, obviously a lot of states, and we'll get into kind of the updates on the states and some of the changes in regulation. But, I think that's an interesting revelation, but interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I find it interesting. When I went through the academy at 20 years old or 21 years old through Peace Officer Standards and Training to join the state police and the Utah Highway Patrol, one of the things that was interesting, one of my classmates was from a local department in southern Utah, and he actually had a master's in clinical social work and was a mid-career change. He was probably in his early 40s and had decided to go into law enforcement, but with his background. And we were all very enamored because he handled the domestic violence situations. He handled the alcohol situations in a very professional way and was very much looking at it from that perspective. And I think there's something to be learned from that. And it's not new. There have been efforts to have social work interactions with law enforcement, ride-alongs, have them as part of that team. And now we're hearing a lot more about trying to beef up the budgets for mental health responses that should have been there for the past 10 or 15 years. I still believe that there's a massive amount of mental health dollars that have been pulled out of all state and local budgets for the past 10, 15 years that have kind of forced a lot of those efforts onto law enforcement as the agency of last resort, and even onto corrections at sheriff's departments and things of that nature. And I think we need to fund them like they should be funded. But I do think that the chief's comments are very valid, that looking at how we train, looking at how we recruit, looking at how we fund law enforcement to get the right skill sets and the right talent in our future recruitment is an important thing to look at. And I think it should be studied in the right way to make sure that we can attract the candidates that we want to make sure are in that 21st century policing model going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, great example, Boston City Council just this past week is looking at legislation to divert, nonviolent, more social service related cases from 911 away from the policing response, and to deal with homelessness and substance abuse, with a separate division. I know we talked about this last week as well with some of the other states are looking to put in place kind of nonviolent social services response teams that will actually be dispatched through 911. So be interesting to see how the regulations change as well, and whether, I think it's two prongs, right? And we talked to, when we interviewed Alex Eastman, we talked about cross-disciplinary interactions and skill sets. And obviously he is a trauma surgeon as well as police. And based on, your story, right? In terms of folks having multiple disciplines, being trained in different areas, that's one area I expect is going to change, as well as then having separate, I'll call it departments or, response groups that will work alongside the police to deal with these different types of cases. So it'd be interesting to see that migration. And, obviously we're already starting to see contemplating that legislation in some cases, that legislation actually being signed into law. So interesting stuff going on.
But I will say that the key is funding to go with that legislation.
Has to be. We talked about this last week, and there's the whole concept of defunding. My personal belief, I think you agree with this, is it's actually probably more funding is what we're going to have to do to deal with this reform in law enforcement. And it's defunding, it's the right funding, right? It's the right funding to the right capabilities. So that's right. More going on around the country. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Colorado. First sweeping statewide legislation for police reform. A lot going on there. It's the new police accountability legislation. It was signed into law on Friday. And it includes things like body cameras requirements, dash cam requirements, limitations on use of deadly force. You've got requirements to intervene if an officer is using excessive force, new data reporting, on activities and use of force, as well as an interesting point, and I know the Supreme Court this week declined to hear and a judge on qualified immunity, the concept of qualified immunity, that police, effectively don't have liability for damages resulting from them operating within the scope of their employment. In Colorado here, they've maintained qualified immunity, but they've limited it to the extent that if there's a violation of a person's rights, that the police will not be able to rely on qualified immunity as a defense. So that's a pretty big step. That's a pretty big, point forward. But a lot going on in Colorado.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think there's a number of elements. It's pretty sweeping. It's pretty quick how it's come to be. I think that the first element is a no-brainer. I think that, really going to full body-worn camera video on during all responses, and full dash cam video or in police car video also being leveraged throughout. This technology has been around for many, many years and widely available. Not only is it widely available, it's now able to be fully streamed live to the cloud and to a command center and all those kind of elements. And its time has come. Many departments have already been progressive in this. I know my former department has body-worn cameras and dash cameras for all the officers, and they've been doing that for a few years. So I'm constantly kind of surprised when departments have not gone to that fully. I think its time is past due, and I think this should be the baseline for good evidence collection. I also think it can greatly reduce the amount of time it takes officers to do reports, because you will have video and audio to look back on, number one, but even number two, some of the more advanced solutions out there are actually using AI to create reports from that video, which we all know, a good 30% of officers' time is spent on reports. And if we can reduce that, we can actually do a lot more with those officers out in the public, and less time focused on typing up reports on a laptop or something else, which they probably don't even need anymore. It's probably much more handheld devices, smartphones, tablets, things of that nature. And so that just needs to happen. I think that's one that every department, all 18,000 plus in the country should.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. And I know there's more to talk about Colorado, but you raise a really interesting point, and I've read a lot about this, and we've seen also the first EMS agency we talked about a couple of weeks ago employ body cameras. I know here in Loudoun, the police are employ body cameras. Given what's going on, I mean, for all those reasons, as well as kind of the accountability factor, and as we know, in any kind of response, certainly if there's an injury, it's not just going to be the police. There could be fire on the scene. There could be EMS on the scene. What about the proliferation of or requirement of body-worn cameras across public safety disciplines, EMS and fire as well? What's your thinking about that?
I don't think it's all the same as law enforcement. I think law enforcement is my primary focus on this piece, but I do think there's different elements that can really be leveraged for paramedics and emergency medical services, EMTs and others. More in the quality assurance, quality review, QA case review side of the house. I think that we could continue to improve training with video to really go back on calls and see what could be done better. I don't think it should be used in a punitive manner on that side. I think it should be in a learning manner. And
it's like, crew resource management, like we talked about last week. Right. I mean, those kinds of very productive and constructive uses.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to my days at Life Flight in Salt Lake City, and one of the things we had was a weekly case review, and we flagged certain cases based upon the critical care interventions that were done or any safety issues that arise from those calls. What was great about it is it was kind of an important safe zone with our medical director to sit down and really critique versus criticize what was done right, what could be done better, what could we learn from that. And it was open to the entire team. And even if you weren't on that call, you were invited to learn from that call. And I think it's so important because you were able to really benefit from the education of other people's difficult calls and what you could learn and do better in the future. And so, I do think there's a lot of value to that.
What do you say about folks that are concerned about the surveillance, the big brother, that whole concept? I mean, to me, the time has come, right? I mean, it's not just, as you said, it's not just about discipline. And although there's been a lot of focus on the police side about having an accurate record, ensuring there's not being excessive forces being used, and et cetera, there, as you said, there are tremendously broader uses for this video technology. Whether it's in quality assurance or, as you said, efficiency in reporting and other things. And as it becomes the norm, and it is in a lot of departments, we're going to see these benefits, right? But there are still, I think some resistors out there. I mean, what do you say to them?
I think help build the policies and procedures that make it rational and safe for both the emergency responders as well as our citizens. And so I think there do need to be safeguards, right? If we have an overzealous supervisor who wants to spy on every call, I mean, that should not be allowed, and that should be disciplined. That's not the goal of these programs. If we have folks that are misusing it to go after an individual because they don't like them, once again, that has to be a policy and procedure that is very hard. And so, you will create new problems, but I think it's a very minor amount compared to the benefits that can come from it. And I think we have to, work with national groups that can help set some national standards on it. So on the law enforcement side, for instance, I think working with some, group like PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, I think that they do a terrific job of being science-based and policy-based to create good national standards. Look at the 21st Century Policing Report that came out from Chief Ramsey and Lori Robinson. That was a great look at about 56 improvements that departments can make across the country. These kind of policy improvements, I think, are so critical to these kind of implementations, and leveraging technology, leveraging public safety broadband networks like FirstNet, leveraging body-worn cameras, and doing it in a uniform and correct sort of way.
Yeah, and PERF was they were very supportive, for example, in kind of the rebuilding of the Camden Police, department, right? And I think, worked very closely with that group when they started over, several years ago, and it has been a tremendous success, and seen a huge turnaround in policing policies and approach, community confidence, in police in Camden, which had been a very, very, dangerous area for a long period of time. So, yeah, I think that's great. Relying on those experts, and I think you're spot on. Be part of the solution, and understand that this is where technology is going. This is where new policing is going. But participate. I think that's a key message, that needs to come through to anyone, especially anybody that's got concerns about it. Then be part of coming up with the way to handle it.
And I appreciate you bringing up the Camden County, New Jersey example where, Chief Scott Thompson was part of the department before and after that radical change. And it's being talked about a lot now on national media because it was a glowing example. And at the same point, it took a couple of years. It wasn't an overnight sensation, significant, amazing results, and really turned into a community-oriented policing department with massive reductions in violent crime, I think 42% over a few years. Wow. But they did work very closely with PERF. They brought in experts from around the world to make sure that they had the best resources there. And eventually, Chief Thompson became the president of PERF because they were so engaged, so involved, and a great example of what can be done. And I think that's a great example for cities around the country that are looking at different reforms and reach out and get other resources and bring in experts and bring in, the key folks that can help do that in the right way. And then also realize it's going to take money, it's going to take time, it's going to take work. It's not just going to be a policy change tomorrow that changes everything. It may help, but there's a lot of work to be done. And it takes a real dedication to change. It takes folks that are not averse to change, and it's hard work.
So perfect segue. We're back in where this, all began most recently, Minnesota. Made a very sweeping statement a couple weeks ago. We're scrapping our current, policing arrangement. We're going to come up with something new, a new way to manage public safety. Latest reports, unable to, come to any agreement between the various, local houses and legislators about how to move forward. And they had a special session held last week. We're not able to make progress. Where are we? What should they be doing? This is some of the frustration I think a lot of the community feels is, not being able to come together to make these reforms and these changes that are important.
Well, I think two things. The devil is in the details, right? I think the first element is the city of Minneapolis is taking one approach, and it's still in progress. And even though they're moving with urgency, it doesn't happen overnight. And secondarily, the point you got to was the Minnesota House, the Minnesota Senate ended up having a walk away from the table moment this past weekend and did not come to any consensus on the critical changes to law. This is a longer standing and a bigger standing problem, I think, in all states, but certainly in Minnesota. And I'll give an example that, back to the Philando Castillo case, part of the things that happened there was the law was what it was. And when the officer was not convicted on that particular case, there was a lot of talk about, well, hey, we need to improve these laws. I won't say just change them, fix them, but improve them to make sure that the appropriate safeguards are in place. And that didn't happen then. And, here we are a few years later, and it still isn't happening yet. And so what that does mean, though, is people have to get to the table and negotiate, and they have to be there in good faith, and it's going to take time and energy and everyone committed to change. And I think it's important. I think we owe it to everyone to have those hard conversations. And I think they're not easy and they're not fun, but I think those hard conversations are the only way that we will get to real improvements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw that what they did at the state level in Colorado. Good news in Georgia legislature is now moving to pass new anti-hate crime and bias legislation, which is something that's been missing, for some time. So, very positive response to this. City of Alexandria, very interesting. Given some of the protesting issues and some of the concerns, have banned firearms from all public facilities and special events and gatherings and the protests. So they're taking an interesting tack as well, where they're being more aggressive on the control of lethal weapons with anybody amongst the public, not just public safety in these areas, to calm potential violent interactions, right, and to avoid them in the first place. Which, interesting, right? Everybody's kind of taking a little bit different tact about how to approach this. Some of it's very police driven, and others, affecting the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what would be an important element of this is let's not forget the research, right? As some of these cultural experiments and policy experiments happen, I think we need to research them, in a longitudinal way where we're looking at what was implemented and what effect did it have. I think there will be unintended effects that could be good or bad. I think there will be intended effects that, we should prove if they work the way they're supposed to. And I think that we should really look at that because that's what the rest of the country needs. I mean, we have, over 3,000 counties in America, for instance, that are going to look at different ways to address this. But if we can study the ones that are moving in the beginning and understand that we're not going to get all the policy decisions right and figure out what works and what doesn't work, and also realize that in, a rural community and a suburban community and an urban community, they may need different policies for different things. And everywhere in the United States is very diverse, and we need to look at what's the best way to handle that from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I mean, AP came out with a report this week, probably not surprising, regarding some of the non-lethal force efforts and tools that are being used with rubber bullets and gas and pepper spray, which may be non-lethal theoretically, but can cause significant injury and damage. And really trying to think of new ways to address crowd control, to address folks that need to have some level of discipline, but in a way that is not effectively attacking or kind of a military style approach to the community and the citizens. So when you think of other non-lethal types of technology that potentially could be leveraged, I think this is going to be a new area that's going to open up and really give creative companies a new opportunity to bring new products to market that balance, the need for policing and to keep control, but also, protect basic human rights and civil rights and ensure that we're doing it in a way that's responsible.
I agree, and I think we're going to see innovation in law enforcement technology around less lethal solutions, and there hasn't been a lot that changed until the past year or two. I think there are some new exciting solutions that are coming on the market that are definitely much safer. I think we're also seeing we need to ensure that officers also can keep themselves from getting into some of these bad situations and use some very less than lethal solutions earlier in the encounters to keep them safer and also to keep the suspects that they're dealing with safer. And so we need to look at that, take this opportunity with what's going on around the world to figure out, are there other options and are there better options and solutions that we should be using? And often it takes big events like this to force us to really look critically at what we use today. And is that the best solution going forward, or should we try something new? And I think it's time to look at something new. In some cases,
you and I are, fans of technology, and there's a lot of changes going on. So, let's talk a little bit about just recently in Atlanta with the Rayshard Brooks situation, and understand that there was a reduction in available policing this week. A number of officers either called in sick or there was a walkout, but whatever it was, it left dispatchers seeking over the radio with kind of narrowband two-way voice, trying to figure out where folks were. And there's going to be any number of different situations that could affect the department where you have few number of police, whether it's budget cuts, whether it's other events going on, whether, sickness, illness. And we need to be able to manage the responses appropriately. And technology can play a really big part in that. And this is one of the limitations of just being able to use radio, right? You can't see anything. You just kind of throwing it out there, and someone needs to be listening to respond. How could technology potentially change that environment and afford better outcomes and better planning and efficiency?
Well, I'm very surprised in 2020 that we're still having, car 54, where are you? That should not be occurring in 2020. 100% of law enforcement officers in this country should be issued a public safety smartphone on a public safety network that will give them video, voice, and data, and allow real-time location services to be provided to dispatch and situational awareness applications. They've been around for years. The capability's been around for years. There's no reason in June of 2020 that every single officer is not issued not just the device, but on the appropriate network with priority preemption, encryption, also having the ability that these solutions provide the right applications for mission critical voice communications, provide the application for situational awareness, so that we know where those officers are and what their status is. Are they on a call? Are they available for a call? There's no reason why a public safety communicator that works in a dispatch center today should not be able to see where all of their resources are, what capabilities do they have, is it a K-9 unit, is it a specialty service, do they have multiple officers available or just one, is there backup nearby? And this shouldn't just be in the CAD, this should be real-time information on a map display that shows them where everybody is that's available. This has been around for years, and so it's very important for our leadership in public safety to make sure that the right tools are there. No more of this car 54, where are you moments over land mobile radio.
Yeah, and a couple of real life examples where I want to get your thoughts. I think are interesting, and both here in Virginia. So one in Loudoun County, one in Prince Edward County. So in Prince Edward, they've now employed text to 911. Mm-hmm. And you sit here and
sorry, checking to see what year it was.
Scratching your head, right? I mean, texting's been around for how long?
20 plus years.
Why now? And shouldn't this be just the norm, the base level everywhere in America?
It should be the base level. I mean, any jurisdiction that has not enabled text to 911 should. But even beyond that, next gen 911 is what really we should be moving to for everyone. And also we're seeing elements leapfrog the technology in the dispatch centers. Rapid SOS obviously has some pretty amazing technology built into the Apple operating system, as well as the Google or Android operating system for all of those devices to be able to give pretty darn accurate location and rich data from emergency calls coming in, as an example. And what's great about that kind of technology is that incident that was on the Potomac, I believe it was, between Virginia and Maryland recently. There was a very tragic drowning, and location was part of that issue. Is that we need to make sure that the old days of triangulating from a cell tower are not the main way to locate an emergency caller. And we have to all make sure everyone has access to that rich data, and that rich data can not only get to a dispatch center, but it can get to the first responder who is on that scene, which means they need to have a broadband public safety device to be able to get the map, see the location, figure it out, because it's very hard to give an address on a river. There are not milepost signs on the river telling you exactly where you're at when you're having a kayaking incident or a swimming incident or things of that nature. And so really accurate location makes a huge difference. Once again, this technology has been around for a few years. It is not brand new. It is time to implement.
No, and I'm glad you raised the situation on the Potomac. Is that was, I mean, it's a matter of a bit of archaic policy, right? I mean, and it doesn't have to be on the Potomac or on any river, any border, or area. As you dial 911, and it's going to be routed based on certain rules. It could be routed to the wrong state. It could be routed to the wrong dispatch center. And then they have to communicate over to the right dispatch center. But if the folks calling in are on a river and can't give an address, as you said, there's no address. How do you know where they are and who should respond? It led to a 35-minute delay, and it was no bad intention, because they just had to figure out the rules with a rapid SOS with real-time location capability built in, which anyone can get today. You don't need to upgrade to a next-gen 911 system or an EZNet to have web access to a rapid SOS dashboard to see location of a cell phone. today. It's all built into the operating system. So anybody can do this across the country today.
And there's not a cost.
And there's no cost. That's right. And so to do that and then be able to have real-time immediate, hey, this person is here, we know who to dispatch immediately. Now, they've in response to this changed some rules and changed some processes. So there's going to be automatic response from both jurisdictions when something's kind of in the middle. But that's still a Band-Aid in my view, because that's an inefficient use of resources, right? If you have the location, and we have the technology to do it, you know where they are, you know how to respond, and you can do it much, much more quickly. And that's going to affect outcomes.
But let's not let these incidents go to waste either. I mean, let's fix that problem both from a policy perspective and a technology perspective, and make sure that the right technologies are implemented to improve that situation for a caller tomorrow. And the other thing is, it's just like a pandemic. You never know exactly when it's going to hit. And so we can't wait. It's urgency along with, smart policy and smart technology implementation that has to be done together. As you know, back in our FirstNet days, urgency was a huge part of what we were always thinking about every single day. And how do we make sure that these solutions are implemented before the next disaster hits, before the next earthquake, before the next pandemic. And luckily, in most cases, we were able to do that, and it made a huge difference. But I think that we always have to act with that urgency, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think for every police chief, fire chief, EMS chief in the country, somebody who's a PSAP director, they have to understand that they've got to move with urgency when it comes to these kinds of changes. And it's hard because there's everyday operations 24/7, 365 that get in the way. I get it. But there's a number of things that have been around for a few years, tried and tested, that work today, that we really need to move to implement. And it's going to take a concerted effort to make it all successful.
Yeah, I mean, spot on. And if nothing else, right, there's low-hanging fruit. Like, as you said, there are certain no-cost options or very low-cost options of technology that can have a huge difference. And I think if there's any message out of this, obviously we're moving on a spectrum. Budgets are going to be changing in light of the pandemic and other things going on. So we understand there's going to be limitations, but there are things that every agency can do today. I think it's critical. We're seeing it. We're seeing the need. We're seeing, citizens are behaving differently because of the pandemic, which means we have to operate differently, and we have to have the tools to be able to protect, our communities and our citizens, as aptly as we can. And so I think your message is spot on, and hope folks are listening and are thinking about ways they can do that. With that said, I think that's a good place to end this week. A lot going on, tremendous amount of news. We're going to keep our eye on everything going on and try to bring you the latest and greatest thoughts on what's going on in public safety and technology. Until next time, I'm Jason Carbon, Esquire, with my good friend TJ Kennedy. PSN News of the Week. We will see you next time. Take care.